Hey guys, tonight we talk about something truly majestic, something elegant, something that encapsulates the very peak of medieval innovation and hygiene. Yes, tonight we explore the toilet, specifically the medieval toilet, a marvel of engineering so horrifying, so biologically offensive, that it makes porta potties at music festivals look like high-end spas. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening in from and what time it is. It's cool seeing people from different parts of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some background noise, and get ready to enter a world where the phrase doing your business was less about privacy and more about hoping the rats didn't bite you mid-defecation. Let's set the scene. You are in a small stone tower, cold and damp. The walls are weeping moisture like they've given up on being solid. There's a breeze, but not the kind that refreshes you, more the kind that carries the scent of 15 generations of fermented peasant poop. You've just eaten your daily ration, some barley mush, half a boiled onion, and a piece of bread so hard you could weaponize it. And now your body is sending the age-old message, it's time, you need to go. But this is the Middle Ages. There's no soft lighting, no gentle music, no lavender-scented air freshener. There's just you, your intestinal distress, and a looming architectural nightmare known as the garderobe. Ah, the garderobe. A fancy word for a medieval poop chute. Typically a small wooden seat built into the outer wall of a castle or house, with a hole cut in it, and a vertical shaft underneath. That shaft led to a pit, or sometimes, if the builder was feeling generous, directly to the moat. Yes, the same moat that enemies tried to cross and nobles pretended was scenic. Now imagine sitting over that hole, pants bunched at your ankles, freezing wind licking your exposed backside, while your entire digestive history free falls into oblivion. It's like bungee jumping without the thrill, only with a much higher chance of catching dysentery. The smell, you ask? Let's talk about that. Medieval life was a symphony of odours, and not a good symphony, not Beethoven or Mozart. No, we're talking medieval public toilet symphony, a mix of open sewers, animal droppings, unwashed humanity, and whatever nightmare fuel was cooking in the communal pot that day. People were constantly surrounded by the fragrance of failure. Bathing happened maybe once a year, twice if you were rich or recently dipped in a river. And toilet pits weren't regularly cleaned out. They were just added to, like some kind of horrible human compost heap. And because medieval architects had priorities like build a dungeon and make it hard to siege, they didn't exactly put a lot of R&D into waste management. Some castles did have cleverly angled chutes so that your output would land safely in the moat. You might think that's smart. Except then you remember that people also drank from the moat. It was a defensive feature and a bacterial soup, all in one. So yes, congratulations, you've now created a circular system where what you eat becomes what you drink. Just like nature intended, if nature hated you. But maybe you're not a noble. Maybe you're just a regular peasant. What did you do when nature called? Well, that depends on how lucky you were. If you were fancy, your home had a cesspit, basically a hole in the ground where all your waste went, covered with a wooden board and maybe some straw for privacy, if you were lucky. If you weren't lucky, and most people weren't, you simply went outside. Yes, the great outdoors, a bush, a wall, an alley, a particularly judgmental-looking cow, wherever seemed appropriate. There were no public restrooms. There were no laws against doing your business in the middle of the road. That's why medieval streets ran with more than just mud and spilled beer. They ran with despair. And if you lived in a city, like London or Paris, congratulations, your life was worse. Because not only were there thousands of people living in close proximity, but they all had the same idea. Let's just dump it out the window. That's right, chamber pots. Big ceramic bowls people used to relieve themselves in during the night. Once full, they were flung out the window with a warning shout, something classy like "Gardiloo," which roughly translates to "Look out below, here comes the contents of my lower intestine." The streets weren't just unpleasant. They were lethal. Slippery, stinking death traps where one wrong step could send you skidding into last Tuesday's lunch, now reprocessed. But hey, there were attempts at plumbing. Sort of. In monasteries and some richer homes, water channels were used to flush away waste, if you can call trickling water over poop flushing. But most systems were poorly maintained, and because nobody really understood germs or hygiene, They assumed bad smells caused disease, which, to be fair, is sort of true. It wasn't entirely wrong. They just didn't know the bacteria were doing the heavy lifting. Their solution? Herbs, lots of herbs. Burn some sage, throw in some lavender, maybe an onion for good luck, and hope the scent overpowers the horror. It never did. Now let's talk about toilet paper. Or, more accurately, the screaming void where toilet paper should be. There was no charmin, no soft-quilted double ply. Medieval people used moss, or straw, or, if they were feeling fancy, rags. But often it was just your hand, or nothing. And you thought running out of toilet paper during the pandemic was rough. At least you weren't wiping with yesterday's dinner wrapper and a prayer. Let's bring it back to the castle garderobe. One of the most insulting things about them was the placement. They were often near the sleeping quarters, because nothing says noble luxury like falling asleep to the gentle sounds of your cousin's bowel movements echoing through stone walls. Some garderobes were even multi-level, meaning that what didn't land in the pit would sometimes catch a breeze and revisit you. And they rarely had doors. Why would they? Privacy wasn't invented yet. You might get a nice wooden panel if you were royalty. If not, well, your dignity didn't make it past the drawbridge. But perhaps the most terrifying part. The rats, the insects, the things that lived in the waste pits. They didn't just stay there, they came out. Crawling, climbing, exploring. You think you've known fear? Try hovering over a dark medieval hole and feeling something brush your leg. There are entire modern horror franchises built on less. So next time you sit on a clean, warm toilet seat, with scented candles and Spotify playing lo-fi beats to relax your colon to, take a moment. A moment to thank whatever modern deity you believe in that you weren't born into a time where relieving yourself was a literal gamble between shame, splinters, or surprise rodent activity. So you've just survived your first medieval bowel movement, possibly lost a bit of dignity, and maybe half a toe to frostbite, because garderobes were about as warm as a haunted cave. Now you return to your straw mattress, slightly shaken, moderately ashamed, and absolutely praying you don't have to go again until next week. But the medieval toilet saga doesn't stop at the drop hole. Oh no, it's time we talk about the unsung villain of the era, the chamber pot. Ah yes, the chamber pot. A simple, innocent-looking ceramic bowl with a purpose so vile it could reduce the strongest man to tears. People kept them under their beds or beside them, so if nature called in the dead of night, they didn't have to brave the icy wind or risk slipping on medieval road soup outside. Instead, you'd sit, squat, or hover above the pot in the pitch dark, praying that the last person to use it had the decency to empty it. Or, at the very least, not miss entirely. Of course, once the pot was used, it had to go somewhere. And in the glorious age of enlightened hygiene practices, the answer was out the window. Imagine this. You wake up, stretch, grab your pot of liquid shame, open your shutters, and casually toss its contents into the bustling street below, possibly hitting a merchant, a chicken, or an unsuspecting child. But it's okay. You shouted Gardeloo first, right? That made it polite. Like saying bless you after sneezing in someone's face. Now imagine living on the ground floor. Every morning is a fresh, terrifying game of what fluid is that? The streets weren't just dirty, they were alive. Slippery, steaming gutters filled with waste, rain, and whatever passed for roadkill that day. And if you were the kind of person who liked to stroll barefoot, congratulations. Your immune system now belongs in a museum. If you made it to 40 without growing a second nose or spontaneously combusting from disease, you were basically a superhero. But wait, what about public toilets? Surely cities had designated spots for this sort of thing, right? Places where the masses could collectively unload? Yes, sort of. They were called privies. Not to be confused with privacy, which did not exist. Privies were essentially larger cesspits, often with a wooden bench and several holes, where you could sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers and bond over bowel movements. Think of it as the original social media feed. Everyone sharing crap, but literally. Some of these privies were maintained by local authorities, if you could call the dude with a shovel and a gag reflex an authority. Others were just pits dug behind houses or shops, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes just dirt. Over time, the pits would fill up, and if no one could be bothered to empty them, they'd overflow. Into streets, into rivers, into people's lives in ways nobody asked for. And that brings us to one of the most elite jobs of the medieval era. the gong farmer. This was the heroic individual paid to descend into cesspits and shovel out the compacted layers of human waste. They worked by moonlight, because somehow even medieval society said, yeah, we don't want to see that during daylight. They'd haul out barrels of sludge and carry them out of town, often dumping them into designated areas or sometimes just wherever no one was looking. Gong farmers were paid surprisingly well for the time, which honestly makes sense. You couldn't pay me enough to play poop archaeologist with a shovel and a prayer. But hey, job security was great. There was always more poop. Still, for many people, in Muslim, especially the poor, the idea of organised waste disposal was a fantasy. Their toilet was whatever was available. A bush, a ditch, a dry well, a forgotten helmet. There are stories of people going behind churches because even divine ground was better than their alley. And because so many people just dumped their waste wherever they could, towns developed a charming feature called night soil, a poetic term for raw, untreated human waste smeared across roads, walkways and doorsteps like some horrific Jackson Pollock painting done in Biohazard. And with night soil came pests. Rats, obviously, but also flies. So many flies. Clouds of them. Flies that carried diseases no one could pronounce. Diseases that could wipe out entire families by breakfast. And because medieval people didn't understand that poop particles and food particles shouldn't mix, it was common for kitchens to be close to privies. Close as in connected. So yes, sometimes the smell of stew had undertones. Then came the rain. Rain was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it washed away the sludge, diluted the smell, and carried the waste downstream to someone else's village. On the other hand, it turned everything into a slush of filth. Streets became rivers of brown mystery liquids. Shoes didn't help. Your feet still got soaked. And the smell? Somehow worse. Like the rain had awakened the ghosts of every bowel movement from the last century. Even castles weren't safe. Remember those castle guard robes from earlier? Many of them drained into pits or the moat. And when the moat flooded during storms, which it often did, it carried a little something extra into the courtyard. There are documented cases of entire castle interiors being flooded with waste. Royal poop tsunamis. Imagine walking through your great hall and having to hold your robe above your knees because last night's dinner decided to pay a visit. But let's not forget the smell again, because if there's one thing that unified every class of medieval life, from peasant to prince, it was the stench. Some towns passed ordinances requiring butchers, tanners, and other smelly professions to dump waste in designated spots. Did that help? Not really, because the air didn't care about your regulations. It just carried the scent of biological betrayal into every room. There are records of kings ordering perfumed walls and scented rushes to combat the smell inside castles. They were literally trying to wallpaper over a sewer. And speaking of rushes, these were what passed for carpet. People scattered rushes or straw on the floor to soak up spills, smells and everything else. Over time, they became nesting grounds for fleas, lice and mould. Changing them was rare. They just toss fresh rushes on top of the old ones. So if you were ever curious what centuries of decomposing filth smelled like compressed into floor insulation, that was your answer. You were basically living on a compost heap with windows. So to recap, you've got streets lined with waste, people dumping pots out windows, toilets with no plumbing, cities soaked in their own filth, and professional poop miners working the night shift. Add in the smell, the bugs, the rats, and the sheer absence of personal hygiene, and you begin to understand why people died at 35 with a smile. They were just relieved it was over. But don't worry, we're just getting started, because next we'll explore what medieval people believed about disease, how they thought bad smells could kill you, and how their solutions were basically the equivalent of spraying perfume on a dumpster fire. Let's talk about how medieval people explained the horrors surrounding them. Because they noticed the smell. Oh, they noticed. You don't live in a town marinating in its own digestive history and not clock the bouquet of wet livestock, fermented cabbage, and existential dread. But here's the twist. They didn't think the smell was a symptom. They thought it was the cause. Enter the miasma theory. This brilliant little hypothesis suggested that diseases were caused by bad air. Yes, according to centuries of learned men in robes and weird hats, if something smelled terrible, it could kill you. Which, to be fair, is how most people still feel when someone microwaves fish in the office. But in the medieval mind, the stench wasn't a warning sign. It was the Grim Reaper itself. just in olfactory form. This idea wasn't new. It went back to the ancient Greeks because if there's one thing medieval medicine loved, it was treating old scrolls like divine truth. Forget experimentation or observation. If Galen said smells bad equals death, then by all that is holy, they were sticking to it. And so their solution to the ever-present medieval poop cloud? Cover it up, not remove it. Just hide it behind something that smelled slightly less like despair. Which brings us to the medieval obsession with herbs. Lavender, rosemary, sage. Not for cooking, no. These were survival tools. People carried them in pouches, stuffed them into clothing, and waved them under their noses as they tiptoed through society's septic system. If you were rich, you might even walk with a pomander, a little metal orb filled with aromatic herbs that you'd lift to your face whenever someone nearby opened their chamber pot with a flourish. Churches and noble houses went a step further. They laid rushes and herbs all over the floors, which sounds nice until you remember they rarely cleaned the floors underneath. So by month 3, you weren't walking on a herbal carpet. You were gliding over a slow, cooking biohazard, infused with faint notes of thyme. Imagine Febreze, if Febreze was made of moss and denial. And what about medical professionals? Surely they had ideas about cleanliness, right? Oh yes, terrible ones. You see, doctors believed that balance in the body came from balancing the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So if you were feeling off, the solution might be bloodletting, a nice relaxing vomiting session, or an enema so aggressive it could legally qualify as an exorcism. Cleanliness? That was secondary, if it came up at all. Some physicians thought bathing was dangerous because it opened the pores, which let the miasma in. So rather than washing, they'd recommend rubbing your skin with linen cloths to get off the visible dirt, then powdering yourself with something fragrant, like crushed rose petals, or, if things were really dire, dried ground-up lizard. Hygiene wasn't about being clean, it was about being not dead. And smelling like crushed gecko was apparently a fair trade. Let's not forget the noble bath. Yes, some medieval folks did enjoy a soak now and then, especially the rich. But because clean water was a luxury, bath water was reused. One tub, multiple people, in descending order of importance. So the lord might bathe first, then the lady, then the children, then the servants, then the stable boy, then the dog, and finally anyone who wandered in off the street and had 5 coins. By the end, the bath wasn't water. It was broth. Human-scented broth. And if you were last in line, well, congrats on your new rash. Even when public bathhouses became popular, they quickly turned into cesspits. Literally. With warm water, dim lighting, and lots of exposed skin, they were basically the Tinder of medieval towns, but with more soap and slightly fewer consequences. But again, cleanliness was cosmetic. You looked better. You smelled slightly less like despair. But the bacteria? Oh, they were thriving. Throw in the fact that most water sources were shared with livestock, and the math becomes clear. Washing with the same river your cow poops in doesn't count as hygiene. It counts as biological roulette. And so, in the endless battle between smell and survival, medieval people just sort of adapted. Like how your nose stops noticing bad breath after 5 minutes of conversation. Their tolerance evolved. Newcomers to cities would gag and cry. But locals, they just lived in it, married in it, raised children in it, died in it, all while believing that if they could just keep the stink out of their nostrils long enough, they might dodge the plague one more year. Speaking of which, let's touch briefly on the Black Death, because it's impossible to discuss medieval sanitation without mentioning the one disease that basically rage quit all of Europe. When the plague arrived, people assumed, you guessed it, that it came from bad air, which, okay, they weren't entirely wrong, but instead of cleaning the streets or disposing of bodies more effectively, they burned incense. They lit fires in the middle of towns to clear the air. One guy even walked around town in a giant beaked mask, stuffed with herbs like some kind of 14th century aromatherapy bird. That guy was a plague doctor, a real profession. His job was to show up, diagnose you by checking your boils, and either prescribe herbs or abandon you to the rats. The mask wasn't fashion. It was believed to filter the air, like some cursed medieval N95. They didn't have vaccines, they didn't have antibiotics, they had plague birds and hope, and also a lot of bleeding. Because nothing says healing like removing 2 litres of blood from a man who just fainted from diarrhoea. Meanwhile, back in your average village, people were still tossing waste out of windows, sharing toilets with 3 generations of family and livestock, and occasionally getting into arguments over who was responsible for cleaning the privy. Spoiler, no one ever cleaned the privy. It was just there, forever. A silent witness to centuries of digestive disasters. And so medieval people walked a fine line between superstition, smell, and survival. Every breath was a gamble. Every bath, a potential curse. Every toilet, a trapdoor into bacterial bingo. And yet somehow they endured. Not because they were clean, not because they were careful, but because life was a constant test of endurance. And also because parasites hadn't learned how to unionize. So as you lie there, tucked into clean sheets, in a world with plumbing and air fresheners, and maybe even a bidet if you're fancy, take a moment to appreciate it. Because 500 years ago, your night might have ended with you holding a clay bowl of bodily betrayal, praying your neighbour didn't throw theirs first. So by now you're probably wondering, who built these things? Who looked at a freezing, wind-blasted stone tower and thought, yes, let's carve a hole into this wall and call it a bathroom? Welcome to the fascinating world of medieval toilet architecture, where the words ergonomics, privacy, and functionality were laughed out of the blueprint meeting. Assuming there even was a blueprint meeting, and not just some guy with a chisel and a personal vendetta against comfort. Let's start with the infamous castle guardrobe, which, if you missed earlier, is a toilet carved into the side of a building. Literally, a hole in a bench that drops straight down, sometimes several metres into a pit, or more often onto the side of the castle wall or into the moat. Because nothing says defend the kingdom like raining feces on your attackers. Practical, yes. Hygienic? Not unless you think rivers of human waste are a bonus feature. Now, the placement of these guardrobes is where things truly get creative. Many were installed next to sleeping quarters because, of course, you'd want your bodily functions acoustically amplified through stone walls during your REM cycle. Some were built into turrets, others jutted out over cliff edges like nature's least inviting balcony, and a few were placed directly above each other, so the upper floor could, in the most tragic cases, become the splash zone for the noble suite below. One unfortunate tilt of the wind, and congratulations, it's raining upstairs. And if you're imagining some kind of privacy curtain, or a little room with a lock, please stop. This was the Middle Ages. Doors were for treasure rooms and cellars. A guardrobe might have a wooden shutter at best, which you could close with a crude latch. More likely, though, it was just a dark cubby in the wall. People didn't care about privacy the way we do today. Modesty was optional. Hygiene, aspirational. And acoustics? Truly unfortunate. Now, why not put the toilets on the ground floor, you ask? You know, like a rational society. Because medieval architects were mostly concerned with defence and grandeur, not sewage management. The upper floors were safer from intruders. And if your only waste disposal system was gravity, you worked with what you had. That meant building your toilet as high as possible and hoping physics would do the rest. This resulted in what can only be described as vertical plumbing, with none of the plumbing. Some castles had multiple guardrobes, one for each floor, stacked like a shameful tower of digestive denial. But here's the kicker. In many cases, they shared the same drop shaft. So whatever was deposited from the top floor would trickle, splash, or enthusiastically plummet past the lower levels. Now imagine being on the middle floor. You've just settled in. You're doing your business. And suddenly a rich stew from the Duke's upper chambers comes hurtling past you like a brown meteor of betrayal. Medieval architecture, the gift that keeps on dripping. But it wasn't just castles. Manor houses and even city homes tried to mimic this elevated waste disposal approach. They built wooden boxes that jutted out over alleys or rivers. These were often shared by multiple households, creating communal drop zones for the street below. Now picture that same wooden box after a few harsh winters. Warped wood, loose boards, a breeze you don't want to think about. And then you sit down. Congratulations. You're playing a game called Will This Support My Body Weight or Drop Me Into the River of Despair? And don't think public infrastructure was any better. Some larger towns had public latrines, communal toilets usually built over running water or cesspits. The design was simple. A long bench with several holes cut into it, side by side, No dividers, no partitions. Just you and a few neighbours having a group experience you'll never speak of again. These benches were often made of stone or wood, and let's just say that they didn't exactly get wiped down between uses. The idea of cleaning meant maybe throwing some ash over the top and hoping for the best. And yes, sometimes they would reuse the human waste. In what might be the least appetising sentence you'll hear today, night soil, as we've mentioned, was collected and used as fertiliser. That's right. Your food grew in yesterday's meals, and while the nitrogen content was great for crops, the whole transferring parasites and bacteria into your vegetables thing was an unfortunate side effect. But it was efficient, and efficiency often beats survival in the medieval priority list. Now let's talk about the toilet paper situation, architecturally speaking. As in, it wasn't accounted for at all. There was no designated place to store moss, straw, or that unlucky rag you'd been reusing all week. People either wiped and dropped, wiped and tossed, or, more often, just wiped and moved on. The out-of-sight, out-of-mind philosophy was applied with reckless optimism. No disposal system, no bin, no plan. Just pray the wind takes it away, or it fuses with the wall, like some kind of medieval fresco. Some of the more advanced toilets had stone chutes leading away from the building, but these were rarely maintained. Over time they'd clog, back up, and begin leaking out of the walls, or worse, into the walls. Archaeologists have literally found medieval homes with internal poop build-up, waste that seeped into the cracks and hardened over centuries. Imagine living in a house that is, quite literally, full of crap. Now, if you were wealthy and paranoid, you might hire a servant to stand guard outside your private toilet cubby. Not for privacy, no, for security. You see, garderobes were one of the weakest points in castle defence. Thin walls, low traffic, close to the outside. That made them perfect for infiltrating spies or, yes, assassins. There are recorded instances of people entering castles through waste chutes. Let that sink in. Somewhere, some poor assassin crawled through a 40-foot shaft of human waste just to stab a baron in the neck. That's dedication. Or madness. Possibly both. So when we say medieval toilets were a war crime, we don't just mean metaphorically. These things were actual breaches of structural and biological safety. They were security risks, disease vectors, psychological hazards, and worst of all, architectural disasters. It's as if medieval architects were building castles with one hand and playing a dare game with Satan in the other. And you might be thinking, well, this is the past, people didn't know better. But here's the thing, some cultures did. The ancient Romans had aqueducts and latrines with running water. The Islamic world had sophisticated washrooms. The Chinese had paper for wiping long before Europe even considered not using rocks. But in medieval Europe, the best design innovation they could come up with was a wooden hole in a wall and the blind hope that nobody looked up from below. So next time you walk into a bathroom with heated floors, a Dyson hand dryer, and soft music playing from the ceiling, take a second to remember your ancestors, squatting over a wind-whipped hole, 40 feet above the moat, surrounded by stone, shame, and structural failure. Let's take a little time travel field trip, shall we? You, dear listener, are now a fully integrated member of a thriving medieval village. Congratulations, you have lice, you smell like old soup, and you've just woken up to the sound of livestock screaming directly outside your door because walls are expensive and pigs need morning attention too. The first thing you feel isn't hunger, it's urgency. That grumble in your gut, the churn. Something inside you is reminding you that last night's meal of questionable fish and overly ambitious beans is about to demand an exit strategy. Now, in our modern world, this is a minor inconvenience. You shuffle to the toilet, do your business, and emerge moments later with dignity mostly intact. But in the medieval era, going to the toilet was an event, a strategy mission, a test of nerves, aim, and social tolerance. If you're lucky, and I use that term loosely, you have access to a chamber pot. It's ceramic, it's cold, and it's been used by everyone in your household, possibly including the dog. You pick it up and contemplate whether it's worth using. It smells like betrayal. You decide it's not worth the psychological damage. Instead, you head outside. Now, it's important to remember, Medieval homes rarely had dedicated toilet rooms. The concept of a bathroom was as alien to them as TikTok is to a medieval monk. Going to the toilet meant physically leaving the house, unless you had no shame, which, let's be honest, most people didn't after surviving 5 plagues and marrying their cousin by accident. So, barefoot, possibly still in your nightshirt, you shuffle toward the outhouse or communal ditch. Along the way, you pass neighbours doing the exact same thing. There's old Geoffrey, squatting behind the blacksmith's shed again, face full of regret. There's Agnes, casually dumping her chamber pot into the street gutter, nodding at you like it's a friendly wave. This is what mornings looked like. A full-blown symphony of grunt splashes and existential despair. Picture rush hour traffic, but instead of honking, it's squelching. And if you think your digestive business was a private affair, think again. In many homes, especially among the peasantry, families shared the same space. And yes, that includes toilet time. You might squat in the corner of your single-room home using a pot, while your grandmother churns butter 2 feet away and your younger siblings build a goat out of hay. You just made eye contact with your uncle while wiping. That's a core memory now. But let's say you're feeling fancy. You live in a slightly nicer house. You have a privy out back, essentially a box with a hole in it above a pit. This was considered luxury. You trudge through the muddy yard, swatting flies and rats the size of corgis. You open the creaky door and are immediately greeted by the smell of 1,000 ghosts who died of dysentery. You sit. The wood is damp. There's no seat, just a vague hope that you're positioned correctly and that the flies aren't currently nesting. You finish. There's no toilet paper, remember? Maybe there's a stack of straw. Or a communal rag nailed to the wall. It's called a bum cloth. It's been used more times than you care to imagine, and it's never been washed. You stare at it. It stares back. You consider wiping with a pine cone. You make peace with your decisions. Now you may ask, how often did people go? And the answer is regularly, but with variety. Diets were heavy in grains, porridge, and whatever local root vegetable was unfortunate enough to survive the winter. That meant fibre. That meant urgency. That meant going to the bathroom was often part of the daily rhythm of village life. Some would even gather around the communal ditch to chat. That's right. Medieval people socialise while pooping. Not unlike today's group texts, but with more eye contact and less dignity. And then there's the nobles. Let's not pretend they had it that much better. Sure, they had private guardrobes, maybe even one with a wooden door and a pillow for your royal cheeks. But they also had servants whose entire job was to empty the waste. Sometimes those servants would be in the room while their lord was going, just standing there, holding a bowl, waiting, possibly making small talk. The rich may have had more padded benches, but they had way more witnesses. And yes, of course, there were toilet accidents. Why wouldn't there be? With slippery wood, no lighting, and sometimes just a literal hole above a pit of doom. Falling in was very much on the table. People slipped. People missed. Children disappeared into waste pits and had to be hauled out with hooks. There are stories, true stories, of nobles falling from guardrobes into their own moats. They died, not from the fall, from what they fell into. That's a sentence you don't want on your tombstone. Even monks had to deal with all this. Yes, the supposedly holier-than-thou cloisters had communal toilets too. Long stone benches with carved holes, one after the other. No stalls, no privacy, just silent, robe-draped judgment. Imagine trying to meditate on divine grace while Brother Thomas next to you is processing 3 bowls of lentils with a sound like distant thunder. Now, children, what about the little ones? Did they have training toilets? Of course not. They had nothing. Kids were allowed to go wherever they needed, which often meant everywhere. Inside out. Outside, during church. You could be mid-sermon when a child just squats in the corner and goes for it, while the priest keeps talking about damnation and fire. It was just normal. And because there was no hand soap, no disinfectant, and no real understanding of how disease spreads, people would go right back to cooking, touching food, or tending wounds immediately after using the toilet. Maybe they wiped their hands on their tunic. Maybe they didn't. You'll never know. And neither did they. Germ theory wouldn't show up for centuries. In the meantime, Life was just one long roulette wheel of microbes and optimism. Let's not forget what happened to all that waste. If you were poor, you dumped it into the nearest gutter. If you were lucky, it flowed away. If you weren't, it sat there and festered, slowly becoming part of the landscape. If you were rich, someone else carried it away. To a field, a pit, or sometimes just the river. London dumped so much waste into the Thames that people caught diseases just by walking near it. Not even touching the water, just being within sniffing distance could ruin your month. And despite all of this, the noise, the smell, the risk of death by splashback, people survived. They didn't enjoy it. They didn't celebrate it. But they did what they had to do. Because when life gives you beans and cabbage and no plumbing, you make fertilizer, whether you want to or not. So next time you're on your phone, comfortably seated, air freshener within reach, maybe even enjoying a Bluetooth speaker, playing ocean sounds, remember this. You are experiencing peak humanity. You are sitting on a throne of modern convenience, looking down at the ghosts of the past who once had to wipe with straw while staring their cousin in the eye. By now you've got the general picture. Medieval people relieved themselves in holes, pots, pits, buckets, moats, and probably on especially bad days, their own shoes. But what happens to that endless torrent of waste in a society with no sanitation infrastructure? Spoiler, it goes somewhere. It always does. And more often than not, it ended up shaping, or rather smothering, the entire city. Let's start with the medieval street. A charming cobblestone ribbon winding through a bustling town, right? Wrong. The reality was less storybook village and more biohazard alley. Streets were narrow, muddy, and slightly concave. Not for style, but because they doubled as open sewers. Builders deliberately sloped roads inward to create a trench in the middle. This trench was where everything went. Waste from chamber pots, kitchen slop, animal droppings, dead rats, failed experiments, and the occasional bodily fluid you didn't ask about. And it didn't just sit there. It moved slowly, glacially, forming streams of putrid slurry that flowed downhill toward the nearest river. If you were lucky, if you weren't lucky, it pulled. Imagine being ankle deep in a liquid that smelled like regret, disease, and curdled dreams. Now imagine slipping in it. It happened. Frequently. And you might be thinking, surely someone was in charge of cleaning this. Yes, kind of, sort of. Enter the rakers and scavengers, the medieval sanitation workers who wielded brooms made of twigs, wore layers of cloth to suppress the smell, and got paid just enough to buy soap, if soap existed. These people were tasked with removing the worst of the muck. But there was a problem. It never ended. Waste didn't take breaks. There were no weekends off for diarrhea. These brave souls were basically trying to empty a bathtub with a fork, while someone poured sewage in from above. In London, some attempts at order did exist. There were laws about when you could dump your chamber pot, typically at night, where it could be dumped, not directly into your neighbour's window, and how to shout the warning, "Garde-lou," or "look out below." But let's be honest, these rules were about as effective as whispering stop at a landslide. Then there were cesspits, glorious, sunken vaults of misery built beneath homes, inns and churches. Yes, churches. You could walk into a holy sanctuary, kneel to pray, and unknowingly be hovering above centuries of divine digestive detritus. Cesspits weren't designed to be cleaned regularly. They were designed to hold waste indefinitely. Unfortunately, indefinitely rarely accounted for the realities of rain erosion and human volume. Over time, cesspits overflowed. The stone cracked, the contents leaked, sometimes slowly, seeping into basements and streets, sometimes explosively, bursting like a cursed piñata full of ancestral guilt. There are actual court records from the 14th and 15th centuries detailing lawsuits where people sued their neighbours because a shared cesspit collapsed, flooding one house with the other's waste. Now imagine explaining that to a medieval judge who is also knee-deep in his own waste issue, trying to stay awake after 3 mead lunches. Let's talk rivers. Once hailed as sources of life and trade, rivers became the great toilet bowls of Europe. The Seine in Paris, the Thames in London, the Tiber in Rome, all were transformed into moving masses of human runoff. Waste flowed freely from every alley, home, and monastery. The smell was biblical. The water, untouchable. Except, of course, people still touched it. They washed clothes in it. They bathed in it. And yes, they drank it. And if that sounds insane, wait until you realise that some breweries used river water to make ale. Yes. The very same ale you're drinking with your rabbit pie may have begun its life swirling past a dead pig and a bundle of week-old cabbage-stewed feces. Cheers. The contamination wasn't just local. When waste reached rivers, it travelled. Downstream villages suddenly found themselves dealing with upstream digestion. Entire cities were connected not just by trade, by poop. In some cases, outbreaks of disease could be traced up a river like a detective story no one wanted to solve. And this isn't speculation. We know this happened because of archaeology. Dig sites across Europe have uncovered massive deposits of compacted waste beneath cities, layers upon layers of human output, fossilised in time. One site in York revealed privy remains so intact that scientists could analyse parasites from the 9th century. That's right. We know medieval diets and diseases because some poor guy didn't dig his pit deep enough. And now we're studying his tapeworms 1,000 years later. He died screaming, and we're publishing his poo in scientific journals. Cities didn't just suffer from smell. The waste actively destroyed infrastructure. Wooden beams rotted, foundations collapsed, bricks crumbled under centuries of acidic slop. There are medieval engineering documents warning builders not to place homes too close to cesspits. Because, and I quote loosely, you will fall into it and regret your choices. These were blueprints based on trauma. Let's talk about one of the most ambitious failures in poop logistics. The Great Stink of London in 1858, a bit late for the medieval period, but absolutely the final boss of centuries of terrible waste management. London's Thames had become so polluted with human waste that in the summer heat, it created a stench so overwhelming that Parliament shut down. They literally evacuated government because the river said no more. Lawmakers soaked curtains in bleach to survive. The press called it the smell of national collapse, and it finally forced England to build proper sewers. It only took a few centuries and one giant floating turd apocalypse. But before that moment of enlightenment, the only thing medieval cities really did about their problem was build on top of it. Literally, they'd pave over waste layers, raise the streets, build new foundations higher, and pretend the problem was solved. That's why if you go to some historic cities today, the current street level is meters higher than the original. Not because of erosion, because of centuries of waste being slowly entombed beneath cobblestone, like some kind of fermented urban lasagna. The irony, of course, is that the people of the time had no clue what they were really doing. They thought bad smells were dangerous, not the invisible bacteria. So instead of cleaning the streets, they burned incense. They carried posies. They avoided smelly neighbourhoods, thinking that disease floated through the air like a fart with malicious intent. The concept of sewer systems, plumbing, or germ theory might as well have been alien technology. And so whole cities, not just individual homes, became monuments to denial. Grand cathedrals rose over cesspits. Royal courts debated taxes while servants scraped waste from the castle yard. And children played hopscotch next to stewing rivers of shared regret. The smell wasn't a problem. It was just part of life. The background noise of medieval existence. A reminder that no matter how rich, how pious, or how powerful you were, at the end of the day your city was still drowning in your collective byproduct. So as you lie there, clean, warm, possibly sipping herbal tea, and deciding whether your diffuser should be set to eucalyptus or vanilla, think about this. Entire civilizations were brought to their knees not by war or famine, but by the sheer, unstoppable force of bad plumbing. Let's start with a thought. Imagine you've just bathed. You're warm, clean, wrapped in a towel. You smell like something vaguely floral. And now imagine a medieval doctor walking in, taking one look at you and shouting, "What are you doing? You're exposing yourself to death." Welcome to medieval hygiene, where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was next to pneumonia, madness, or possibly demonic possession. So, why the anti-bath agenda? Well, it starts with a misunderstanding of pores. Medieval thinkers believed that when you bathed, your pores opened like little windows to your soul, which, sure, is poetic, But they also thought those open pores allowed diseases to fly in, like evil spirits with bad timing. So instead of being something that protected you, cleanliness was basically a health risk. You were better off caked in filth. It kept the bad air out. Now, this wasn't just a peasant belief. This was established medical opinion. Educated men in robes, who were considered experts because they owned a book and a mortar and pestle, told people to avoid full-body baths unless absolutely necessary. Washing too much could weaken the body, or disrupt the balance of your humours, or make your organs panic and flee your rib cage, or whatever the medieval equivalent of immune system dysregulation was. Of course, people still wanted to feel clean, even if actual bathing was dangerous. So they invented the medieval version of a dry shampoo lifestyle, partial washing. They'd rinse their hands, faces, and occasionally feet. But full-on bathing? That was for special occasions, like weddings or plagues, or when you'd finally lost a bet. Now let's talk soap. Yes, it existed, but unless you were rich, it was more likely made from animal fat, ashes, and lye, which smells about as nice as you think it does. It was rough, both in texture and scent. Using it felt like exfoliating with beef jerky. People who made soap were considered lower-class tradesmen, and they often smelled like their work, which means if you were clean, you were either very wealthy or you smelled so bad from making the soap that nobody got close enough to notice anyway. Some folks turned to herbal concoctions for cleaning. Rosewater was a favourite among the wealthy. Lavender-infused rinses, sage smoke, crushed mint. It sounds fancy until you realise most of it was used to cover up the fact that you hadn't bathed in 6 weeks and had lice staging a full-blown musical in your hair. Then we have urine. Yes, urine. Good old medieval pee. You see, urine was considered a powerful cleaning agent. It contains ammonia, after all, nature's own astringent. So people collected their own waste and used it to clean everything from clothing to their own skin. Some even used it to whiten their teeth. I repeat, people in the 1400s were swishing with pee and calling it mouthwash. Suddenly, medieval dentistry makes so much more sense. And speaking of dentistry, or what passed for it, let's briefly consider how people cared for their teeth. Or rather, didn't. Toothbrushes were twigs. Toothpaste was made from burnt bones and crushed herbs. People rubbed ashes into their gums and chewed on sage to freshen breath, which is hilarious because no one in medieval Europe had fresh breath. The air itself was too offended to let it happen. So what did people smell like? Short answer, bad. Long answer, very bad. Longer answer, a complex blend of unwashed fabric, human waste, animal funk, expired stew, damp mildew, and the crushing knowledge that no matter how rich you were, you'd still have to poop in a box and wipe with moss. The smell wasn't a detail, it was a character, a daily physical presence in people's lives. Even kings and queens weren't immune. You think royal robes and shiny crowns meant they smelled like roses? Think again. Many wore the same heavy garments for months, layered over sweaty linen that hadn't been washed since their coronation. The royal guardrobe might have been fancier, maybe with a cushion or two, but their hygiene was still medieval-grade disaster. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. Which sounds ambitious for the time. There were public bathhouses, especially during the earlier medieval period. These were actually quite popular at first. Communal, gender-segregated, and often accompanied by food and music, like Spa Day meets Tavern Brawl. But then the Black Death happened, and syphilis, and various moral concerns about what people were doing in the baths. Public opinion shifted. The bathhouse went from being a place of relaxation to a rumoured den of disease and sin, and by the late medieval period, most had shut down or turned into glorified brothels with warm water and zero soap. Now imagine you're a visitor, travelling from town to town. You arrive in a new city, fresh off your rat-infested cart. The first thing that hits you isn't the scenery. It's the stench wall. A massive olfactory slap across the face. You pass people doused in herbs, dried cow dung lining the walls, waste running through the gutters, and children playing in what might be either mud or something more tragic. It's not charming. It's not rustic. It's a test of endurance. But here's the thing. Despite all this, people weren't walking around feeling filthy. Because when everyone smells bad, no one smells bad. The nose adapts, you stop noticing. Just like we don't really smell our own homes unless we leave for a while and come back. Medieval people were living in a cloud of normalised funk. You didn't smell yourself, you smelled others, and unless someone was genuinely rotting, you probably gave them a pass. Which brings us to the ultimate medieval hygiene coping strategy, spiritual purification. Instead of scrubbing your body, you cleansed your soul. Confession, fasting, prayers, all considered more important than rinsing your feet. Why bother washing your hands if your soul's still dirty, right? It's not like germs exist, just sin and stink. But they weren't all oblivious. There are records of doctors and monks writing about the benefits of bathing, especially in hot springs. In fact, monasteries sometimes had the cleanest water sources in Europe. Monks understood that disease and filth were linked, even if they didn't know why. The issue was that most people didn't live near monks, and even fewer wanted to take health advice from guys who spent 90% of their time copying Latin in dark cellars while eating boiled weeds. And so, the myth persisted, that too much washing could hurt you, that smelling like you'd lost a fight with a swamp was normal, that covering yourself in herbs, dried dung ash, or someone else's urine was preferable to scrubbing with soap. And from this belief system came a legacy of poor hygiene that would haunt Europe for centuries, quite literally, as the smell lingered long after the people were gone. So as you lie there tonight, in a clean bed, probably with a mattress that wasn't stuffed with straw and lice, take a deep breath. It smells like laundry detergent. Not sage, not boiled onions, not regret. That's called progress. You are not in medieval Europe. You are clean. You are safe. And no one will throw urine on you in the street tomorrow. Probably. Picture this. You wake up in a straw bed, your joints ache, the air smells like boiled turnip and mildew, and you know what's coming. Today's another shift down in the pit. You are one of the brave, unfortunate, disturbingly essential members of medieval society known as a gong farmer. If that job title sounds charming, it isn't. Gong was an old word for human waste. And farmer meant you harvested it. Not crops, not sheep, not anything pleasant. Just raw, fermenting, communal bodily output. You were the sewage collector, the privy dredger, the guy people pretended not to see when walking past the back alley, even though they'd be knee-deep in disaster without you. Gong farmers worked at night, not for mystery or romance, but because no one wanted to see their job being done in daylight. Their task was simple, horrifying, and consistent. Climb into cesspits and scoop out human waste that had been festering for weeks, months, or, in some cases, years. This job made modern hazmat teams look like spa workers. No gear, no gloves, just a spade, a bucket, a strong stomach, and a slowly dying will to live. And this wasn't just an occasional thing. Cesspits needed regular clearing, or they'd overflow, collapse, or start leaking through the floorboards into whatever sad room sat above them. Gong farmers were paid relatively well for their time, sometimes more than skilled labourers, because no one else would do it. Not even outlaws. You could rob a noble and be forgiven. But ask a man to climb into a pit of fermented medieval misery, and suddenly he's considering a life of crime instead. But it wasn't just physical filth. Gong farmers were socially untouchable. People would cross the street to avoid them. They were seen as cursed, dirty, contagious, like they personally created the waste, instead of removing it. They lived on the fringes of town, slept in isolation, and were barred from certain public areas. Think lepers, but instead of a disease, they just carried the collective shame of everyone's digestive system. Now you might be wondering, what happened to all that waste once it was scooped out? Enter our next unfortunate job, the night soil man. While gong farmers handled deep cesspits and large structures, night soil collectors went door to door with buckets. They'd empty chamber pots, outhouses, or make special pickups from privy pits behind homes. All of it was carted out of the city and dumped in, wherever the city allowed. Sometimes it was spread in fields as fertiliser, a beautiful medieval cycle of eating food, pooping out that food, and then growing new food with the poop of the old food. Farm to toilet to table, truly organic. Other times it was dumped into lay stalls, large heaps of human waste on the outskirts of town, often near tanneries, pig farms, or other places where the air was already ruined. And if you think the job was just gross and smelly, think again. It was deadly. Cesspits often contained toxic gases like methane or hydrogen sulfide. There are records of gong farmers passing out or even dying from fumes while down in the pit. Others were crushed when poorly built cesspits collapsed. Imagine dying buried alive in centuries of warm waste. 1 second you're scooping, the next you're part of the compost. Medieval OSHA was just a guy shouting, "You all right down there?" and never hearing back. Then there were the latrine builders. Their job was to construct the actual toilet systems, stone benches with holes, wooden platforms, garderobe shafts. They had to factor in location, drainage, if any, distance from water sources, and whether the wind would carry the stench directly into the Lord's dining room. These builders were often blamed when the system inevitably failed, clogged, or exploded due to poor use. Because when you're building a glorified poop chute out of timber and hope, something's bound to go wrong. And let's not forget the waste transporters, people who carted waste across towns and cities. Their carts were leaky, their paths were public. And when they hit a bump, it was everyone's problem. There were complaints about them splashing passers-by as they made their way through narrow roads. Yes, this means what you think it means. You could be walking to market, thinking about bread, and end up wearing someone else's breakfast in your hair. Other jobs touch this horrifying industry indirectly. Tanners, for example, used urine to soften animal hides. Fullers, who worked with wool and cloth, also used urine to clean and bleach fabric. If you ever wonder why everyone from the Middle Ages looks grumpy in their portraits, it's probably because they knew their clothes had been rinsed in public pee. Or worse, their own. And because soap was expensive and rare, even cleaning tools were disgusting. The cloth used to wipe down surfaces might be a reused rag from another household. The brush used to scrub floors, probably also used to stir laundry. Everything was multi-purpose in the worst way. If a broom didn't smell like tragedy and vinegar, was it even medieval? These workers, the diggers, the haulers, the scrubbers, kept cities from drowning in their own filth. They were the invisible infrastructure of civilization. Yet they lived like ghosts, underpaid, overexposed, and often blamed for the very filth they tried to remove. If a plague broke out, people accused them. If a privy collapsed, it was their fault. If a noble got a whiff of something unpleasant during his roast goose dinner, he'd send someone to beat the nearest wasteman with a stick. Sanitation was a thankless, filthy, dangerous job, and it was essential. But here's the twist. Despite their misery, some of these workers gained weird social power. A few cities allowed gong farmers to own land outside the walls, where they dumped waste and cultivated fields. These plots, rich with, let's call it enhanced fertilizer, were surprisingly productive. In time, some night soil workers actually became landowners. They smelled like death, but they were feeding the city. Literally. Others formed guilds, organised groups with regulations, rules, and payment standards. In rare cases, they banded together to strike or negotiate better pay. Yes, the world's earliest unionised poop labour. A terrifying but strangely inspiring bit of human resilience. So next time you're in a public restroom and see a janitor quietly mopping the floor with infinite patience, take a second to thank them. Not just for today's clean toilet, but for centuries of quietly heroic work that started with a bucket, a spade, and a deeply unfortunate career path. You are living in an age where toilets clean themselves, floors are sanitised with pleasant-smelling chemicals, and no one has to dig a trench in the dead of night to make sure your hallway doesn't smell like sadness. That, my friend, is luxury. Let's say you're house hunting. It's the year 1382, and you're looking for a place with just a bit more space and ideally a waste disposal system that doesn't involve rats biting you mid-squat. The estate agent shows you 3 options: a noble's castle, a monastery, and a peasant's cottage. Spoiler, all of them will end with you reconsidering indoor plumbing as the single greatest human invention. Let's start with the fanciest option, the castle. You might think, surely royalty had decent toilets. You'd be wrong, painfully wrong. What they had were guardrobes, and as we've established earlier, these were glorified wooden benches built over vertical shafts, usually placed high in towers for maximum gravity. The seat was basically a wooden board with a hole in it, positioned precariously over a long drop to a pit, a moat, or the unforgiving stone courtyard below. These were often shared between dozens of people. Entire castle wings might rely on a single shaft. If you were lucky, yours had a little curtain for modesty and a ledge where you could balance a candle. If you were unlucky, it had nothing, just you, the echo chamber, and the occasional breeze up your undercarriage reminding you that medieval life had no chill. The term garderobe literally comes from guarding one's robe, because some people believed the ammonia fumes from human waste would kill moths and keep their clothes pest-free. Yes, that means people hung their clothing in the toilet chamber. You haven't lived until you've tried to retrieve your tunic while someone else is using the family drop hole. Now, while castles often had multiple guardrobes, some of them surprisingly decorative, built into the walls like small alcoves, they rarely had any actual plumbing. Waste would just collect in pits at the bottom. Cleaning it was a seasonal horror show. And remember, during sieges, these waste pits weren't just full, they were weaponized. Attacking soldiers trying to scale castle walls might be greeted not just with arrows, but a surprise load of piping hot biological despair dropped from above. Next up on our tour, monasteries. You might assume monks, those clean-shaven, robe-wearing, prayer-chanting guys, lived in serene hygiene. Not quite. Monasteries were often large complexes, and yes, they had latrines, sometimes even sophisticated ones. Some were built over flowing streams to carry away waste. A few even had stone channels and seats, basically the Cadillac of medieval toilets. But the experience was still a group activity. Monastic toilets were often set up like bathroom benches, long slabs with multiple holes cut into them. No walls, no partitions, no doors, just you and Brother Jerome, side by side, doing the Lord's work while pretending not to notice the sound of 3-day-old lentils leaving someone's body with audible regret. It wasn't just about relief either. Using the latrine was part of the daily monastic routine. There were rules, schedules, prayers. Everything was ritualized. In some monasteries, silence was enforced even while using the toilet. You haven't known awkward until you've tried to silently pass gas into an echoing stone chamber while 30 robed men pretend nothing is happening. Still, in terms of engineering, monasteries were ahead of their time. They used water to remove waste, at least in theory. In practice, when the stream dried up or got blocked, all of that glorious design turned into a backed-up sewage vault that no one wanted to claim responsibility for. So yes, monks sometimes lived cleaner, but not by much, and definitely not by modern standards. If you told a monk about the concept of a scented bathroom candle, he'd probably cry and assume you were a saint. And now for the third and final stop on our tour, the peasant's home. Brace yourself. This one's rustic, very rustic. Picture a small wooden or wattle-and door with a dirt floor, one window and a goat that lives inside with you because the barn collapsed last winter. Your toilet? There isn't one. Peasants relieved themselves outside. Behind the house, in ditches near the compost heap, or, on rainy days, into a bucket kept under the bed, if you were lucky enough to own a bucket. Chamber pots were luxury items. Some peasants used hollowed-out gourds. Others simply squatted wherever seemed appropriate, and hoped it wasn't someone else's spot. The smell was a given. Homes didn't have airflow. Thatched roofs trapped heat. Fires burned constantly. Add a bucket of fermented family waste and a couple chickens living indoors. And congratulations, you've recreated the sensory experience of medieval, lower-class life. Warm, wet, and vaguely hostile. Even when outhouses were present, they weren't much better. A wood shack with a hole over a pit, often used by the entire village. No lighting, no cleaning schedule, no separation of waste types, and no rules against animals living down there. If you sat too long, something might sit on you. And if you fell in, good luck. You either emerged with a new perspective on life, or you didn't emerge at all. We often forget that medieval houses weren't built with waste in mind. They were built to not collapse during storms. Toilets were an afterthought. Most waste disposal was done in public, or at the very edge of town, often near water sources. Which is ironic since those same water sources were then used for drinking, cooking, and baptizing your children. What could possibly go wrong? In larger villages, people might share a communal trench dug out behind the tavern or bakery, a place where everyone went to do their business, usually surrounded by buzzing flies and a social atmosphere that really killed the romance. It was normal to chat while squatting, share gossip, complain about taxes, and then walk away without wiping, because the moss was wet and nobody wanted to deal with that. Privacy was non-existent, dignity was optional, and cleanliness? A future fantasy. So next time you find yourself judging the design of a modern bathroom, maybe the tiles clash, or the toilet paper is the wrong ply, just remember you're not sharing a medieval bench with 6 monks and a squirrel, waiting for the stream to start flowing again. At this point, you're probably thinking, surely toilets couldn't get worse. And that's where you'd be wrong. Because medieval people weren't just afraid of falling in, or rats or diseases. They were also afraid of what might be waiting for them in the dark. Yes, for many, the humble latrine was more than just a pit of shame. It was a portal to the supernatural. A cursed hole. A gateway to hell. A place where demons, witches, and the spirits of the unfortunate lurked, waiting. You see, in a world with no electricity, where your average toilet experience took place alone, outside, at night, with only a candle and your prayers, your imagination ran wild. And medieval imaginations were very active, especially when the nearest explanation for a strange noise wasn't wind in the pipes, but a minor demon trying to possess your butt. Let's start with the most famous of all toilet horrors, the toilet demon. In medieval folklore across Europe, it was believed that evil spirits, imps, or even Satan himself could lurk in the privy pit, especially if it hadn't been blessed or if someone had died nearby. Latrines were dark, wet, stinking, and physically lower than everything else. And in medieval symbolic logic, lower equals evil. Anything beneath you was suspect, including your own bodily functions. So, naturally, the hole you sat over, that was a danger zone. Some people believed that when you squatted down, vulnerable and exposed, the devil could enter you through your, back entrance. This led to some truly hilarious prayers, specifically designed to protect your soul while pooping. Actual records exist of people muttering invocations to saints while doing their business. Imagine whispering, "Saint Benedict, shield me from the evils below," while desperately trying not to lose balance on a wet wooden plank. And the fear wasn't always metaphorical. There were stories, wild, ridiculous, utterly believable stories, of people being dragged down into the pit by demons never to be seen again, or of hearing whispers from the depths calling their name, or of glowing red eyes peering up from the hole just as they were about to do their thing. Honestly, if a rat brushed your ankle in that context, you'd probably die from sheer terror on the spot. One particularly grim German folktale tells of a woman who used the toilet late at night and was possessed by a demon that lived in her cesspit. For the next 6 days she spoke in tongues, convulsed at mass and foamed at the mouth. The local priest performed an exorcism, and when asked where the demon entered, the answer was, you guessed it, the unguarded hole beneath her. That poor woman's bathroom break made local legend. Meanwhile, the demon, presumably, went back to lurking in the sewage, waiting for the next fall, with a weak spiritual firewall. To combat this, many households kept protective charms near their toilets. These included herbs believed to repel evil, small crucifixes nailed above the seat, and even tiny bells, because apparently demons hated noise. Some nobles commissioned monks to bless their guardrobes. If you're wondering whether it's awkward to have a priest bless your toilet, the answer is yes. But if it keeps a sulphur-scented goblin from crawling up your spine mid-poop, you might be willing to risk the social shame. Witches were another frequent scapegoat for toilet-based weirdness. If your cesspit overflowed, a witch cursed you. If your latrine collapsed and your goat fell in, definitely witchcraft. If you developed a rash from wiping with mouldy moss, black magic. It was the one-size-fits-all explanation for medieval inconveniences. People genuinely believed witches could hex your toilet so you'd never feel relief. Imagine blaming your constipation on your neighbour's grandmother. Now imagine starting a trial over it. Toilets also became battlegrounds for spiritual morality. Defecation was seen as a necessary evil, a reminder of your sinful, flesh-bound body. Some monks wrote about the act of defecation as a humbling experience meant to remind you that even kings must poop. Others feared it was a time when your soul was weak, distracted by the body's needs and thus vulnerable to attack. So you had to remain spiritually vigilant, even while doing something as basic as removing last night's stew from your digestive ledger. There's even documentation of latrine ghosts, spirits of people who died from toilet accidents or illnesses contracted near privies. These ghosts weren't dangerous in the jump scare sense. They were more pitiful, moaning softly, rattling chains, smelling like mildew and shame. Some were believed to haunt specific public toilets, giving rise to rumours that certain stalls were cursed. You might have your pick of 10 benches, but no one used the far left hole, because once a monk used it and died screaming 3 hours later. Coincidence? Maybe, but why risk it? Even royalty wasn't immune to this paranoia. Some kings refused to use unfamiliar guardrobes when travelling, and instead insisted on a portable throne. Literally, a seat that could be set up and cleaned by loyal servants wherever they stopped. Imagine travelling with your own collapsible poop zone, just to avoid the wrath of an angry privy ghost. Rich people problems, medieval edition. And then there were the rituals. In some areas, especially during the early medieval period, people practiced pre-defecation rites, short prayers, symbolic gestures, or even lighting incense near the pit to cleanse the air. Others made the sign of the cross before sitting, as though they were entering holy combat. And, honestly, they kind of were. But not every culture leaned into the demon angle. In some regions, toilet spirits were protective. They watched over the household. If you treated the latrine well, they'd bless your bowels and keep the cesspit clear. If you abused it, clogged it, disrespected the space, or mocked the smell, they'd retaliate. This included everything from sudden illness to loud, embarrassing noises in social situations. Basically, medieval karma was real, and it lived under your toilet seat. Children were warned about these spirits constantly. Don't go at night. Don't look down the hole. Don't sing while squatting. Why? No one knew, but the rules were firm. Breaking them meant a high likelihood of ghostly consequences, which, in retrospect, may have just been parents trying to stop kids from playing in the latrine. Still, the result was a generation of people terrified of their own waste. And let's not forget about toilet dreams. Yes, they had those too. In medieval dream books, dreaming of using a toilet was a bad omen, often associated with financial ruin, public shame, or betrayal by loved ones. So if you woke up from a night of pit-based nightmares, congratulations, your week was now doomed, as if being constipated wasn't stressful enough. So yes, toilets were disgusting, dangerous, and often disease-ridden, but they were also spiritually loaded, a physical and metaphysical hotspot, a place where the veil between worlds thinned, and your digestive tract was the battleground for demons, curses, and whatever unsettling lump you found in the moss pile. Next time you wander into your clean, tiled bathroom, flip on the lights and sit on a softly padded seat in total privacy. Remember this: no one's whispering in your ear from beneath the bowl, no one's cursing your bladder, and no one's haunting your toilet. Hopefully. Let's say you're a medieval general planning to infiltrate a castle. You've studied the gate, the walls, the guards. You've considered siege ladders, trebuchets, and bribery. But what if I told you the most vulnerable point in the entire fortress, the Achilles sphincter, if you will, was the toilet? That's right. While your enemy was busy building murder holes, arrow slits, and boiling oil stations, their guardrobes, those charming poop chutes hanging off the side of towers, were essentially unguarded access points dangling in the breeze. A vertical shaft leading directly inside. In other words, medieval backdoor access. Literally. There are documented cases where attackers infiltrated castles through the guardrobe. Yes, through the sewage system. Imagine the conversation. Sir, should we scale the wall? No. Tunnel under the moat? No. Then how? We're going in through the poop hole. One of the most infamous examples comes from the Scottish Wars of Independence. In 1200 Scotland, a small castle was captured after soldiers climbed up the waste shaft. Not the gate, not a secret tunnel. They crawled through solidified waste to ambush guards in their sleep. That's the kind of mental warfare you can't teach. It's forged in trauma. Those men didn't just win a castle, they won the right to never be questioned again. It wasn't just sneaky access either. Toilets were an architectural liability. Garderobes were built into walls, which made them weak points. Siege engineers would identify where the waste dropped out, then target those areas with catapults or battering rams. If they could break through the privy shaft, they could breach the wall. Medieval castles had literal crap-based vulnerabilities. Not exactly the legacy a noble wants. And it gets better. Some castles tried to use their toilet systems defensively. Waste from guardrobes would fall into moats, and yes, those moats were sometimes used as a weapon. Not with spears or spikes. With cholera. Invading soldiers who tried to wade through the moat risked infection, or worse, slipping and falling into a soup of human horror. It's a low-budget biological warfare tactic. Weaponized diarrhea moat. And because of this, moats weren't the picturesque blue rings we see in movies. They were swamps of sludge, filled with algae, bugs, old armour, dead fish, and decades of waste runoff. If you drank from the moat, congratulations, you just swallowed 700 years of castle breakfast, and possibly a plague. But it wasn't just warfare. Toilets played a surprisingly grim role in assassination. One poor king, King Edmund Ironside of England, is rumoured to have been murdered on the toilet. One version of the story says that an assassin was hiding inside the latrine, waiting under the seat with a dagger. Waiting. Your toilet will not collapse into a moat, and your city's defence plan doesn't hinge on the structural integrity of a wooden plank hovering over a death pit. You are safe. For now. So far you've crawled through cesspits, dodged tumimans, and watched kings die on the throne in every way but noble. But what about the manners of it all? Surely there were rules, right? This is medieval Europe, a place where entire books were written on how to properly hold a spoon. You better believe there were expectations for your bathroom behaviour, even if the bathroom itself was a wooden bench over a hole that occasionally screamed back. Let's start with the most absurd, rank-based toileting. Yes, your social class determined where, when, and how you were allowed to relieve yourself. Royalty had private guardrobes with plush wooden seats and maybe a curtain. Nobles had semi-private stalls tucked into castle corridors. Servants? They had shared privies or chamber pots. Peasants? They had the great outdoors and the mutual understanding that dignity was optional once your knees were bent and the moss was damp. But even among nobles there were rules. You couldn't just waltz into the lord's privy and plop yourself down. There were schedules, access hierarchies. Servants would literally wait outside the latrine, sometimes holding cloths, incense or towels. Not for themselves, for you. Think about that. You're trying to find some peace while a 14-year-old apprentice stands patiently 6 feet away, waiting to hand you a lemon-scented rag, and definitely pretending not to hear anything. If you were important enough, you didn't even wipe. Someone else did. Enter the incredibly real, unbelievably unfortunate role of the groom of the stool, a royal position in the English court. The groom was responsible for helping the king complete his business. That included managing the cloth, ensuring privacy, and yes, occasionally assisting with cleanup. It was intimate, undignified, and paradoxically, one of the most powerful positions at court. Why? Because if someone wipes your royal behind every day, they hear everything. They know your secrets. And no one wants to cross the man who knows how long you were in there and what you ate last night. Some medieval etiquette manuals included entire sections on how to use the toilet properly, including tips like, don't make noise, don't talk to others while going, don't go where your social betters have gone unless invited. Always cover up afterward, not just yourself, but the smell. In other words, even while dropping your peasant stew into a wooden hole, you were still playing the social hierarchy game. There were also rules about when it was appropriate to relieve yourself. Defecating during meals, frowned upon, during church, blasphemy. In someone else's field, technically illegal, unless you were related to them or had paid a small tax in advance. Yes, some villages had pooping fees. Don't have the coin, better clench. In cities there were unspoken zones. Certain alleyways were unofficially designated as public toilets, and using the wrong wall could get you yelled at by a local, or in extreme cases fined by city officials. One 14th century ordinance in Paris explicitly banned people from excreting near market stalls, because apparently the fresh fish merchants were tired of losing business to sidewalk stink. But it wasn't all shame. In some villages, group pooping was a social event. Shared privies meant shared stories, shared jokes, and occasionally shared trauma. You might find yourself squatting beside your neighbour, catching up on gossip while flies staged a concert on the wall. One report from a 15th century traveller notes that certain inns had rows of privy seats, wherein travellers do make their business, and oft speak of politics while they do so. Imagine having your political opinions questioned while trying not to lose your balance. There were also gender norms at play. Women were expected to be discreet, even more so than men. Female chamber pots were designed with skirts in mind, and if a woman needed to go in public, she often did so behind wagons, cloaks, or out-of-sight corners. To be caught in the act was a scandal, unless you were giving birth, in which case all rules were temporarily suspended and replaced with collective wailing and prayers. Children, they got away with anything. Up to a certain age, children were basically seen as ambulatory chamber pots. They relieved themselves wherever and whenever. Floors, corners, laps, it was all fair game. This is why so many medieval homes were scattered with rushes and straw. It wasn't decoration, it was damage control. Guests in noble homes were expected to use designated privies, and if you used the wrong one, say, the private garderobe of a baron's favourite son, that could be grounds for public shame, or even ejection from the feast. Imagine being banned from dinner because you picked the wrong hole. And then there was toilet conversation etiquette. Simply put, don't. Talking during bathroom visits was considered deeply inappropriate, unless you were very drunk, in which case it was tolerated but not encouraged. Monks took this rule seriously. In some monasteries, speaking in the latrine was considered a sin, punishable by fasting or extra chores. So not only did you have to do your business in a freezing stone chamber next to 24 robed men, you had to do it in complete silence, pretending everyone else wasn't also praying their beans didn't betray them audibly. Even your choice of wiping material could carry status. Soft linen cloth? High class? Moss and straw? Peasant life. One 13th century noble reportedly had imported wool cloths perfumed with rosewater. Imagine having custom scent-matched toilet wipes while most of the continent was sharing a crusty, communal rag nailed to a post. There were even superstitions about timing. It was believed that pooping right before a battle was bad luck. Why? No one knew. Probably because if you were nervous enough to need the toilet before combat, you weren't likely to come back. Better to hold it in and die with dignity than go out mid-evacuation. But perhaps the most important unwritten rule was this: don't make eye contact while pooping. That was universally understood. Whether you were sharing a monastery bench, squatting behind a bush, or caught mid-action in the wrong alley, you avoided eye contact at all costs. To do otherwise was a social faux pas so intense it could shatter friendships and start feuds. So while medieval toilets were architectural nightmares, the social minefield surrounding them was somehow worse. Every visit was a test of timing, rank, geography, etiquette, and luck. Use the wrong hole, at the wrong time, in the wrong way, and you weren't just gross, you were scandalous. So next time you go to the bathroom without asking permission from a baron, paying a mud tax, or bowing to the groom of the stool, count your blessings. You are living in an age where poop is no longer political. Imagine this. It's 6 a.m, the monastery bells are ringing, and you've got a bowel movement knocking at the gates of heaven. But before you sprint off to the communal stone bench of judgment, there's a question weighing on your mind. Is this spiritually appropriate? Welcome to the deeply awkward and shockingly common medieval religious obsession with defecation, or as one monk put it in his own Latin manuscript, the moral exit of the flesh. Let's start with the basics. Medieval religion viewed the body as gross, not just imperfect, but actively traitorous. It farted, it bled, it craved things, and it pooped. And that made monks, priests, and theologians very uncomfortable. So naturally they turned it into a moral issue. To poop too eagerly? Lustful? To enjoy the relief? Gluttony? To take too long? Sloth. That's 3 sins in a single squat. And you haven't even wiped yet. The average medieval theologian would have written an entire chapter about your Tuesday morning bathroom break. Some monasteries even issued bathroom schedules to avoid temptation. You were only allowed to relieve yourself at certain hours, ideally in silence, and definitely without any visible signs of pleasure. If someone heard you say, "ah" on the bench, you were getting double chores that week. You might be wondering what kind of society turns basic hygiene into penance. The answer? One where cleanliness was next to godliness. but only if you hated every second of it. And then there were the saints. Some saints were so pious, so disgusted by their own bodies, that they refused to use toilets entirely. That's not a joke. There are documented cases of holy men and women who viewed bowel movements as worldly indulgences. Instead, they tried to fast themselves out of needing to go. One infamous 13th century mystic reportedly claimed she hadn't defecated in 11 tunnels. Now either she achieved the world's most spiritually efficient metabolism, or her companions were lying to protect her saintly street cred while quietly digging trench graves out back. Others punished themselves after pooping. Seriously, some monks whipped themselves for losing spiritual focus while relieving themselves. One abbot reportedly wore a spiked belt during every visit to the privy to remind himself that the flesh was weak and must be disciplined, even mid-wipe. But monks weren't just ashamed of the act, they also believed it was a time of spiritual vulnerability. As your body opened, so too could your soul. Demons could enter, or worse, your soul could leave. This wasn't metaphorical. They feared that your soul might literally escape out your butt if you weren't spiritually fortified. To guard against this, many monasteries had blessed privies. Seriously, the same way they blessed water or bread, they would bless the latrine chamber, not because they cared about hygiene, but because they didn't want Satan to take you mid-squat. Some monks even prayed before and after pooping, asking for forgiveness for any unclean thoughts they may have had while attending to the flesh. You try focusing on divine purity while your digestive system is staging a revolution and your sandals are slipping on wet flagstones. Sermons also use toilets as moral metaphors. Priests would compare sin to feces, the soul to the body, and salvation to, well, flushing, if flushing had existed. One popular analogy described confession as the great spiritual purge. Another called gluttony, the sin that swells the gut and clouds the spirit until the soul must heave it forth in penance. Catchy stuff, truly inspirational. Church art sometimes depicted hell as a series of latrines, pits of fire and filth, where sinners squatted for eternity. One French manuscript even shows demons shoving souls into a literal toilet hole, which might explain the average child's fear of outhouses for the next 400 years. Nothing like religious trauma layered with splashback. And because confession was key to salvation, some priests worried that people would lie about their toilet habits. That's right. You could be accused of spiritual pride for pretending you didn't poop like everyone else. Pretending to be above defecation was seen as false humility, and false humility was a sin. So if you were caught being too clean, people would start whispering that maybe you were a closet heretic. Or worse, French. Some penitent practices even involve defiling yourself intentionally, monks rolling in dung, flagellants smearing ashes on their skin, or saints who refused to bathe for decades as a form of humility. The idea was, if Christ suffered, so must you, and if suffering included smelling like the inside of a compost heap, even better. The nose was just another pathway to God after all. Interestingly, the Islamic world at the time had far more advanced ideas about hygiene. Muslim cities had bathhouses, running water, sanitation rules, and specific prayers for bathroom use that focused on health and gratitude, rather than shame and spiritual terror. Meanwhile, in Christian Europe, people were still debating whether God could smell your sins through your poop. One bizarre example comes from a 12th century monk who believed toilets should be windowless, so angels wouldn't see you during your carnal moments. This man truly believed that heaven was peeking in, judging your posture. And let's be honest, if that's true, then most of us are going to need to explain a lot of phone time. And if you were sick, God help you, literally. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, and bowel diseases were considered particularly humiliating signs of sin. If you had diarrhea, people assumed you were guilty of gluttony or lust. If you were constipated, clearly you were holding in secrets. Either way, you were getting judged by every robe-wearing man in town. To top it all off, there were relics, yes, holy relics associated with toileting. Some churches claimed to have the chamber pot of a saint, or a blessed latrine seat. Pilgrims would visit these sites not to pray for wealth or healing, but for intestinal peace. Imagine travelling 100 miles barefoot to kneel beside a sacred wooden seat and ask for the strength to digest goat stew without incident. So let's be clear, the medieval church didn't just care about your soul, it cared about what your soul smelled like, how often you used the latrine, and whether you looked too happy doing it. It moralised digestion, it demonised bowel relief, and it left a legacy of shame so deep that even modern humans feel weird talking about poop in public. That's right, if you've ever pretended not to fart in an elevator, blame the 11th century. Next time you visit the bathroom and feel even a flicker of guilt for taking too long, remember this, you're not being watched by monks. No one's keeping a logbook of your bowel movements. Your bathroom doesn't require a priestly blessing or angel-proof curtains. You are free. But maybe say a little thank you anyway, to the saints, the sinners, and the poor groom of the stool, for suffering so that you could poop in peace. Let's begin with an obvious question that took humanity way too long to answer. What happens when you let everyone's waste pile up in the streets, in pits under their homes, or in open ditches running past the bakery? The answer? Nothing good. Not for your health, your shoes, or your nose. The 18th century saw more attempts at improvement. Cities hired more nightmen to clean waste. Dumping in public became a finable offence. London even started paving its streets and covering sewers. But the big shift didn't come until the Industrial Revolution, when populations exploded and the smell became unignorable, when thousands of people are pooping in close proximity and the Thames smells like Satan's armpit. You have a problem. In 1858, the Thames literally boiled during a heatwave, a moment now known as the Great Stink. Parliament had to suspend sessions because the smell of human waste was so overwhelming it made politicians flee, which, ironically, is probably the most relatable thing politicians have ever done. This stink-fueled crisis finally forced action. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, an engineer with the stomach of a rhino and the patience of a saint. He designed a massive underground sewer system for London that rerouted waste far from the city and into treatment facilities. It was expensive, ambitious, and required convincing hundreds of lawmakers that poop mattered more than pride. But it worked. Bazalgette's sewers are still in use today, and he's remembered as the man who saved London from drowning in its own crap, a noble title if there ever was one. Other cities followed: Paris, Berlin, New York. Slowly, humanity accepted that toilets weren't just about comfort, they were about survival. Germ theory finally caught on, and people realised that cholera wasn't God's punishment or demon farts, it was water contaminated with poop. Who knew? By the late 19th century, the modern flush toilet became a reality. Sanitation became a public health concern. Waste was treated, not just buried. And for the first time in history, humans figured out how to separate their food from their feces without using a river as the middleman. But here's the thing. It shouldn't have taken 500 years, multiple plagues, and a river fire to get here. Toilets were obviously bad. The systems were clearly dangerous. But change was slow because nobody wants to talk about poop, especially not in public, and especially not when they have to admit that they've been living above a compost pit for 3 generations. So next time you flush and walk away without thinking about it, know this: you are the product of centuries of denial, death, innovation, and one particularly stinky summer in 1858. Thanks Sir John Harrington, thank Bazalgette, and thank every unsung gong farmer who risked their life crawling through filth so that someday you could poop in peace. Now drift. Float. Let your thoughts unravel like parchment in the breeze. Let the last of the noise settle to the bottom. There's nothing more to hear, nothing more to learn. Only the slow, sinking comfort of the end. The moon is high. The castle is quiet. The privy door is closed. And somewhere in the distance, a history professor just woke up in a cold sweat, unsure why. Good night, my friend. Sleep deep. And may your dreams be free of latrines, always. Vashindi.